Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine this scene. A gentle breeze drifts through tall grass on a quiet summer evening. The leaves on nearby trees rustle softly, almost like a lullaby, while the glow of a candle flickers against the walls of a wooden farmhouse. Perhaps you hear the faint creak of a rocking chair on an old porch, or the distant hum of insects in the countryside. Let this calmness surround you, as if you are sitting by a warm hearth with history itself ready to tell its story. Tonight, we will journey together into the life of a man whose vision changed the very rhythm of modern civilization. This is the story of Henry Ford and the American dream. To understand Henry Ford, we must first step back into the America of the mid-19th century, the world into which he was born. America was still a nation in progress, stretching its borders westward, experimenting with democracy, and healing from the wounds of civil war. The American dream, though not yet called by that famous name, was a living idea. It was the belief that an ordinary person, with hard work and determination, could rise above circumstance, find opportunity, and create a better life for their children. This dream was shaped by the land itself. Most Americans were still farmers, tied to the soil, growing their own food and depending on horses, wagons, and their own strength to survive. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit were beginning to swell with industry. But for millions, life was still quiet, rural, and bound by the seasons of planting and harvest. It was in this world that Henry Ford was born in 1863, in a small farmhouse outside Detroit, Michigan. His story would carry him from this quiet farmland to the forefront of industrial America, and in the process, he would redefine what the American dream meant for millions, not just in the United States, but around the world. Henry Ford was the first son of William and Mary Ford, Irish immigrants who had come seeking stability in the New World. He grew up on a farm, like most children of his generation, surrounded by fields, barns, and the steady rhythm of rural chores. Life was simple yet demanding. Every day brought work, milking cows, tending crops, repairing fences. But Henry was not content with the plow in the field. His mind was restless and his hands were curious. From a young age, he showed fascination with how things worked. Family stories recall that he would often take apart small farm tools or watches, just to understand their inner workings, and then reassemble them again. One relative remembered young Henry sitting for hours at a workbench, carefully handling gears and springs, his eyes glowing with determination. When Henry was 12 years old, he saw his very first self-propelled machine, a portable steam engine. The sight captivated him. Unlike horses, which tired easily, or men who labored endlessly, here was a machine that seemed to move with its own life, powered by fire and steam. Henry later said that this moment, watching the hissing, smoking engine come to life, set his imagination ablaze. He began to dream of machines that could make work easier, faster, and more reliable than ever before. By the time Henry reached his teens, Detroit was no longer just a frontier town. It was becoming an industrial hub, fueled by factories, shipyards, and foundries. The city's population was swelling with immigrants and opportunity seekers, each drawn by the promise of steady wages and modern life. Henry, though tied to farm chores, felt this pull. He once remarked that he never really liked farm work, only the machines that made farming easier. By the age of 16 in 1879, he made a decision that would shape his entire future. He left the farm and moved to Detroit to become a machinist's apprentice. It was a bold move. For a young man raised in the quiet countryside, Detroit must have felt overwhelming. The clang of metal on metal, the belching smoke of factories, the crowded streets filled with wagons and carriages. Yet Henry thrived in this environment. He worked at the James F. Flower and Brothers machine shop, and later at the Detroit Dry Dock Company, where he honed his skills with engines, boilers, and precision tools. Here, surrounded by the sparks of industry, Henry discovered not only his natural mechanical skill but also his true calling. He was not destined to simply repair machines. He wanted to build them, to shape the future with his own hands. The late 19th century was a golden age of invention in America. Thomas Edison had lit up the night with his electric bulb. Alexander Graham Bell had carried voices across wires with the telephone. Railroads crisscrossed the country, shrinking distances, while steel and steam reshaped cities and industries. Henry Ford came of age in this world of rapid change, and he absorbed its energy like fuel. He studied engines, particularly the new internal combustion engine, which promised to be smaller, lighter, and more efficient than bulky steam power. By the early 1890s, Ford was working for the Edison Illuminating Company, maintaining electric power plants. This was no small job. Electricity was still new and mysterious, and Edison's company was at the very forefront of this revolution. It was here that Henry Ford gained not only technical experience but also confidence. He worked long hours, often being called out at night to repair engines or generators, but whenever he had free time he returned to his private obsession, building a machine that could move on its own, without horses, powered by gasoline. In a small shed behind his home, Henry Ford set to work. Using spare parts, bicycle wheels, and a 2-cylinder gasoline engine he had built himself, Ford created his first vehicle. It was a strange-looking contraption, more like a large buggy than a car, but it ran. On June 4, 1896, Henry Ford rolled out his invention, the Quadricycle, and drove it down the streets of Detroit. The machine had only 2 forward gears, no reverse, and had to be steered with a tiller, like a boat. It rattled and shook, but it moved. For Ford, it was a triumph, proof that his dream was possible. But Henry's ambitions went far beyond a single machine. At this time, automobiles were luxury toys for the wealthy, handcrafted by specialists and far too expensive for ordinary people. Ford began to envision something radical, a car for the masses, an affordable machine that every working family could own. This idea was revolutionary, but it spoke directly to the spirit of America. The nation was full of hardworking men and women who dreamed of independence, of being able to travel, explore, and live better lives. Ford believed the automobile could be the tool that unlocked this freedom, not just for the rich but for everyone. In later years, Ford would famously say, "I will build a motor car for the great multitude. It will be so low in price that no man will be unable to own one, and enjoy with his family the blessing of hours of pleasure in God's great open spaces." At this moment in his life, the dream was still far away. His quadricycle had drawn attention, but it was still just a prototype. Ford needed backing, he needed factories, and he needed to refine his vision. The road ahead would not be smooth. His first ventures into business would bring as much failure as success. But the seeds were planted. And allow the sound of distant crickets, the soft sigh of wind through open fields, and the steady glow of firelight to bring calmness to your thoughts. History is best told slowly, like a story around a warm hearth where each moment unfolds in its own time. Our journey with Henry Ford continues, not with immediate triumphs, but with setbacks, experiments, and the stubborn persistence that marked his early years. Every great dream, after all, is tested by failure before it takes flight. When Henry Ford first rolled out his quadricycle in 1896, it captured the imagination of those who saw it. The strange, rattling contraption was hardly graceful, but it proved something extraordinary, that the automobile could work. Detroit, still a city of factories and horse-drawn wagons, had witnessed the spark of something new. Ford was proud, but pride alone could not build a business. He needed money, partners, and the belief of others who could see his vision. The first attempt came with the Detroit Automobile Company, formed in 1899 with investors willing to back Ford's ideas. Here was his chance to move from tinkering in a shed to manufacturing cars on a real scale. But the company struggled almost immediately. The cars were too expensive, too heavy, and not reliable enough. Ford, focused on engineering perfection, built vehicles that took too long to produce and cost too much to sell. The investors, eager for profit, grew frustrated. In less than 2 years, the company collapsed. It was Ford's first major failure. Yet to Henry Ford, failure was not an ending but a teacher. He learned that his obsession with detail had to be balanced with practicality. He could not simply build a perfect machine. He had to build a practical machine, one that ordinary people could afford and use. This lesson would guide him for the rest of his life. Undeterred, Ford tried again. In 1901, he founded the Henry Ford Company with new financial backers. But history repeated itself. Conflicts with investors, disagreements over design, and pressure to produce high-end cars for wealthy buyers left Ford dissatisfied. He wanted to build for the many, not the few. Once more he walked away, leaving his own name behind. The company he abandoned would later become Cadillac. 2 failures might have ended another man's career, but Ford remained convinced of his vision. To attract attention and prove his designs, he turned to an unexpected stage: the racetrack. At the dawn of the 20th century, automobile racing was wildly popular. Crowds flocked to see these new machines compete, and victories on the track meant credibility in the marketplace. In 1901, Ford unveiled a lightweight car with a powerful two-cylinder engine. That October, at a race in Grosse Pointe, Michigan, he faced established drivers. Nervous but determined, Ford climbed behind the wheel. Against the odds, he won, shocking the crowd and making headlines. His victory proved that he could design not only reliable cars but fast ones too. With new confidence, Ford built an even more powerful machine, the 9999, named after the fastest train of the time. In 1902, his car roared to victory in another race, this time with Barney Oldfield, a daring young driver, at the controls. Oldfield would become a legend in racing, but for Ford, the victory brought something even more valuable: publicity. People now knew his name. Investors began to listen again. In 1903, Henry Ford, with the support of 12 investors and a capital of $28,000, founded the Ford Motor Company. This was his third attempt at an automobile business, and this time the pieces began to fall into place. The company's first car, the Model A, sold modestly but successfully. Unlike his earlier ventures, Ford had learned to focus on simplicity and affordability. The Model A was sturdy, practical, and priced within reach of middle-class buyers, but Ford was not satisfied. He believed he had only scratched the surface of his vision. In his mind, the automobile was not to be a luxury or a novelty. It was to be a necessity, a tool as common as the plow had been to farmers. He often spoke of wanting to democratize the automobile. While other companies produced sleek, expensive models for the rich, Ford dreamed of a car for everyone. Detroit in these years was alive with energy. Dozens of automobile companies sprang up, each competing for the attention of buyers. Names like Oldsmobile, Packard, and Buick filled the newspapers. Many would rise and fall within just a few years. But Ford distinguished himself by his single-minded focus on the masses. He was not trying to build the best car in the world. He was trying to build the car that most people in the world could actually buy. Still, obstacles remained. Manufacturing cars was slow, laborious, and costly. Each vehicle was built by hand, piece by piece, in small workshops. Skilled craftsmen worked long hours, but production was limited. Cars remained expensive, out of reach for most families. Ford began to think not just about the car itself, but about how cars were made. He asked a bold question: what if automobiles could be built faster, more efficiently, and in greater numbers than ever before? What if the process of building a car could be transformed? By 1908, after years of trial and error with various models, Ford and his team introduced the car that would embody this vision: the Model T. It was simple, durable, and affordable. It could handle rough country roads, start easily, and carry a family without difficulty. Its engine was strong but not overly complex, and its parts could be replaced if needed. Most importantly, it was priced lower than many competitors, making it accessible to ordinary Americans. The arrival of the Model T marked a turning point. Sales grew quickly and demand spread beyond Detroit to small towns and rural communities. Families who had relied on horses and wagons suddenly saw a future of independence. They could travel farther, faster, and with greater comfort than ever before. The automobile, once a curiosity for the wealthy, was becoming a part of everyday life. As the glow of lamplight softens in our imagined farmhouse, picture the world at this moment. The year is 1908, and Henry Ford stands on the edge of greatness. His company has found its footing. His dream is beginning to take shape. But the true revolution is yet to come. For it will not be enough to build a great car. He must find a way to build millions of them, quickly, cheaply, and consistently. Close your eyes once more and picture the steady crackle of a fireplace, the faint scent of wood smoke drifting upward, the warmth filling the room while outside the world grows quiet under the cover of night. In such a setting, it feels easier to step back into time and imagine the world of Henry Ford as he stood at the beginning of the true revolution he was about to unleash. The Model T had been introduced, and with it came a new era. But the Model T was not just another car. It was the gateway to a dream, a symbol of freedom for millions, and a machine that would change the pace of life in America forever. When the Model T first appeared in 1908, few could have predicted the scale of its impact. The car was sturdy, reliable, and surprisingly simple to operate. Its design favored practicality over luxury. Farmers could drive it across rough dirt roads. Families could pile into it and journey farther than they had ever imagined. Mechanics found it easy to repair, and the price, though still not cheap for a working man, was within reach of more people than any car before it. Ford once described his creation with a sense of pride, saying it was a car for the multitude, not just for the privileged few. But a good car was only part of the story. To truly make the Model T the people's car, Ford had to solve an even greater challenge: how to produce enough of them. In the early years, even as sales grew, cars were still being built in the old way, assembled by hand in small teams with each worker responsible for multiple tasks. Production was slow and costs remained high. Ford wanted to change that. He believed the process of building a car could itself be reinvented. He studied other industries for inspiration. In meatpacking plants, animals were moved along rails while workers stood in place, each cutting a single section in turn. In breweries, bottles were filled and capped in organized steps. What if car manufacturing could work the same way, with each worker focused on a single, simple task, while the product moved steadily down a line? This thought became the seed of one of the greatest industrial innovations in history: the moving assembly line. In 1913, at the Highland Park plant in Michigan, Ford's team experimented with this idea. They broke down the building of a Model T into a series of small, precise tasks. Instead of one man building a large portion of the car, each man would master a single motion, repeating it again and again as the car moved past him. Gears, bolts, wheels, and frames advanced down the line piece by piece, until at the end a finished car rolled out. The results were staggering. What once took more than 12 hours to assemble could now be done in just over 2. Later refinements reduced the time even further, to about 90 minutes. Production soared. Costs fell. For the first time, mass production had truly arrived in the automobile industry, and with it came a revolution in how the modern world worked. But Ford's vision went further still. He did not want only to build cars cheaply. He wanted to sell them cheaply. As production became more efficient, Ford slashed the price of the Model T. In 1909, it cost about $800. Within a decade, the price had dropped to less than $300. For the average American worker, what had once been an impossible dream was suddenly within reach. Families who had never imagined owning an automobile now found themselves driving down country roads, exploring towns miles away, and embracing a new kind of freedom. The numbers tell the story. In 1909, Ford sold about 18,000 Model Ts. By 1916, that number had grown to nearly 500,000. By the 1920s, the company was producing more than 1 million cars a year. The Model T was no longer just a product, it was a cultural force. It shaped how cities grew, how families traveled, even how people thought about time and distance. Yet the assembly line was not only a triumph for Ford, it was also a challenge for his workers. Repetition was grueling. Standing in one place for hours, tightening the same bolts or attaching the same wheels was monotonous and exhausting. Many workers quit after only a few weeks. Turnover was high, and Ford realized that if he wanted his system to succeed, he needed to change not just the process but the conditions of labor itself. In January of 1914, Ford shocked the world by announcing that he would pay his workers $5 a day, more than double the average wage at the time. Critics accused him of madness, claiming such generosity would ruin the company. But Ford had a bold logic. Higher wages would attract better workers, reduce turnover, and most importantly, allow his employees to become customers. If workers earned enough to buy the very cars they built, demand would grow even further. The results were immediate. Thousands of men lined up outside Ford's factories, eager to secure one of the prized jobs. Turnover plummeted. Productivity increased. And just as Ford predicted, many of his workers eventually drove home in Model Ts of their own. The $5 day became a landmark in industrial history, setting a new standard for wages and drawing global attention. Ford's influence was spreading far beyond Detroit. Industries around the world studied his methods. Assembly lines began appearing in factories that produced everything from sewing machines to canned goods. Economists and business leaders spoke of the Ford system as a new way of organizing work. And ordinary Americans found their lives transformed. Towns that had once been isolated could now connect by road. Vacations became possible, with families driving to lakes, parks, and cities. Goods could be delivered faster, businesses could expand farther, and the country itself began to feel smaller, more connected. But while the assembly line and the Model T brought prosperity, they also raised new questions. The speed of work, the loss of craftsmanship, and the pressure of industrial discipline created tensions. Some saw Ford as a genius who had given freedom to millions, while others saw him as a man who had reduced human labor to mere cogs in a vast machine. Both views contained truth, and both would shape his legacy. Picture again the warm glow of firelight in our imagined room, the quiet settling around us as another chapter closes. Henry Ford had achieved what once seemed impossible. He had taken a dream of a car for the common man and turned it into a reality for millions. The Model T was everywhere. The assembly line was reshaping industries, and the $5 day had set a new standard for the American worker. Yet with success came new challenges: competition, criticism, and the question of how long the Model T could hold its throne. And let yourself hear the faint sound of wheels turning on a gravel road, the distant call of a train, whistle fading into the night, and the steady rhythm of a clock on the wall. The world of Henry Ford, now firmly built upon the success of the Model T, was racing forward with the energy of a new century. The car that had once been dismissed as a toy for the wealthy had become the heartbeat of America, and Ford himself was celebrated as the man who had given ordinary people the gift of mobility. Yet as the 1920s dawned, his empire would grow larger than anyone could have imagined, and with growth came both glory and shadows. By the early 1920s, the Model T was everywhere. Across America's cities and farms, it became a common sight. Black-painted, boxy in shape, but reliable and loved. Children learned to crank its engine, families piled inside for Sunday drives, and farmers relied on it to haul goods across rough roads. In just a little more than a decade, the automobile had gone from rare luxury to everyday necessity. People no longer lived bound to the radius of a horse's endurance. Now they could travel miles in a single afternoon, see relatives in distant towns, and move freely in ways their grandparents could not have dreamed. The numbers told the story of Ford's dominance. By 1921, half of all cars in the world were Model Ts. In rural communities, the phrase "getting a Ford" became almost synonymous with getting a car. His factories, now producing vehicles with astonishing speed, churned them out by the thousands each day. The moving assembly line had become a marvel of the modern age, studied by business leaders, economists, and foreign governments alike. Ford had not only built a car, he had built a system that reshaped the global economy. And yet Ford himself was a man of contradictions. He disliked extravagance and distrusted bankers, yet he presided over one of the largest industrial fortunes in the world. He championed the common man, yet he also sought to control his workers' private lives through moral guidance and company rules. In his own way, he was both a visionary and a stubborn traditionalist, qualities that would help him soar but also drag him down. One of Ford's most famous sayings was that customers could have the Model T in any color, so long as it was black. To him, black paint dried fastest, allowed for greater efficiency, and kept costs low. But this simplicity, which had once been a strength, slowly became a weakness. By the mid-1920s, competitors such as Chevrolet and Dodge began offering cars with more colors, sleeker designs, and features that appealed to a growing middle class eager for style as well as practicality. America itself was changing. The 1920s were the jazz age, a time of urban growth, cultural experimentation, and consumer choice. Radios, movies, and fashion all reflected a society that wanted variety and expression. The black, boxy Model T began to look outdated, a relic of the past decade. Sales, once unstoppable, began to decline. Ford, however, refused to change. He believed deeply in the Model T, in its simplicity and utility, and he resisted calls from his managers and even his son Edsel to design a new model. His stubbornness nearly cost him everything. Meanwhile, Ford's personal influence extended beyond cars. In 1918, he had purchased a newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, where he published controversial articles, some of which drew harsh criticism for spreading harmful ideas and prejudice. While Ford's genius as an industrialist was unquestionable, his opinions and actions outside the factory sometimes tarnished his reputation, creating storms of controversy that followed him for years. Yet even as he faced criticism, Ford's impact on American life grew. The $5 day continued to be a symbol of better wages, though it came with strings attached. His company's sociological department monitored workers' homes, habits, and lifestyles, insisting on sobriety and certain standards of behavior. Many saw this as paternalistic, others as intrusive. Still, jobs at Ford Motor Company remained coveted, and workers by the tens of thousands sought them. Through the 1920s, Ford's empire expanded globally. Plants were established in Europe, South America, and Asia. The Model T became not just an American car but a worldwide phenomenon, its presence stretching from dusty roads in South Africa to bustling streets in London. It was said that if you traveled anywhere on Earth and saw an automobile, there was a good chance it was a Ford. At home, the car was reshaping society. Roads were improved, highways built, and entire industries arose around the automobile. Service stations, motels, diners, and roadside attractions. Farmers could bring crops to market faster. City workers could live farther from their jobs, giving birth to the suburbs. The car was no longer simply a machine. It was a way of life, symbolizing independence, opportunity, and progress. But time is relentless, and so is competition. By 1927, it was clear that the Model T had reached the end of its dominance. Sales had fallen sharply. Families wanted more comfort, more color, more choice. After nearly 2 decades of resisting, Ford finally made the painful decision to end production of the car that had made him famous. With a heavy heart, the last Model T rolled off the line in May of that year. More than 15 million had been built, a staggering number that made it one of the most successful products in history. For many Americans, the end of the Model T was like saying goodbye to an old friend. It had carried them through dirt roads, through wartime, through the prosperity of the 1920s. It had symbolized the very spirit of mobility and independence. But Ford knew that to survive, he needed something new. Together with his son Edsel, he began developing the next great car, the Model A. Unlike the plain Model T, the Model A would be stylish, colorful, and modern, reflecting the desires of a new generation. In late 1927, the Model A was introduced with great fanfare. Crowds gathered to see it, and demand was enormous. The car was not as revolutionary as the Model T had been, but it was a necessary step forward, showing that Ford could adapt, at least for a time. As you sit with the quiet hum of history in your thoughts, imagine the crossroads where Henry Ford now stood. He had built an empire and defined an age. His cars had transformed the landscape of America and the lives of its people. Yet the world was changing faster than even he could control. The Great Depression loomed just ahead. Competition was growing fiercer, and Ford himself, aging and set in his ways, would face new tests unlike any before. Settle once more into a calm and steady rhythm, as though the world around you has softened into twilight. Picture a gentle fire glowing in a hearth, its warmth pushing back the chill of evening. The faint rustle of wind through nearby trees seems to carry with it the echoes of the past, guiding us deeper into the story of Henry Ford. We have watched him rise from a farm boy in Michigan to the architect of the modern automobile industry, and we have seen his Model T transform the lives of millions. But history, like the turning of seasons, brings new challenges, and the era that followed the roaring 1920s would test Ford, his company, and the American dream itself in ways no one could have imagined. The year was 1929, and Ford had only just released the Model A, a car meant to replace the now outdated Model T. Crowds had lined up eagerly to purchase it, signaling that Ford could still capture the public's imagination. Yet before the glow of this triumph could fully set in, the nation was struck by catastrophe. In October, the stock market crashed, sending shockwaves through banks, businesses, and households across the United States. The Great Depression had begun, and with it, the economy spiraled downward into one of the darkest chapters in American history. For Henry Ford, who had long prided himself on independence from Wall Street financiers, the Depression seemed at first like a storm he might weather with relative ease. He had little patience for bankers and had often boasted that his company needed no outside help. But even Ford's empire could not remain untouched. Demand for new cars plummeted as unemployment soared. Families who once dreamed of upgrading their Model T or purchasing a new Model A suddenly struggled to put food on the table. The automobile, once a shining symbol of prosperity, now stood as a reminder of luxuries out of reach. Ford's company faced enormous strain. Plants were forced to slow or halt production. Thousands of workers were laid off, and those who remained found themselves caught between meager wages and grueling conditions. Ford himself, who had once been praised for introducing the $5 day, now seemed increasingly disconnected from the hardships of ordinary people. He resisted unionization fiercely, believing that his paternalistic oversight of workers was sufficient. To him, organized labor was not a partner but a threat. The tension came to a head in the 1930s as workers began to organize despite Ford's opposition. Strikes erupted across the automobile industry, and confrontations sometimes turned violent. One of the most infamous episodes occurred in 1937, known as the Battle of the Overpass. At the River Rouge plant in Dearborn, union organizers handed out pamphlets advocating for the United Auto Workers. When suddenly Ford's hired security men descended on them, the organizers were beaten brutally in broad daylight, and photographers captured the shocking images. These photos quickly spread, tarnishing Ford's reputation and showing the world that the man who had once championed fair wages now stood as an enemy to organized labor. Ford's reluctance to adapt in this new age mirrored the stubbornness he had shown with the Model T. While competitors like General Motors embraced change, diversifying their offerings and cultivating relationships with unions, Ford clung to old ways. His belief that he alone knew what was best created rifts within his own company. Even with his son Edsel, who urged a more modern and cooperative approach, Edsel Ford, serving as president of the company, had a gentler and more diplomatic style. He pushed for new car designs and better relations with workers, but his father's domineering presence often overshadowed him. Their relationship was strained, filled with respect but also frustration. In time, this tension would take a heavy toll on Edsel, whose health declined under the weight of the struggle. As the Depression dragged on, Henry Ford's image in the public eye grew more complicated. He was still admired as a pioneer, the man who had put the world on wheels. Yet his resistance to unions and his controversial views left many disillusioned. His Dearborn Independent newspaper had already caused damage in earlier years, and though Ford later issued a public apology for its content, the scars remained. For a man who had once seemed a symbol of progress, the 1930s revealed his flaws with painful clarity. And yet, amid all this turmoil, Ford Motor Company endured. The Model A sold well enough to keep the company afloat and new models followed. But Ford no longer dominated the market as he once had. General Motors, with its strategy of a car for every person purpose, steadily overtook Ford in sales, offering consumers choices in color, style, and luxury. The simplicity that had once made Ford king now made him seem behind the times. Still, Ford's factories remained among the largest and most powerful in the world. The River Rouge plant, a sprawling industrial complex, symbolized both the heights of his vision and the hardness of his rule. At its peak, it employed more than 100,000 workers producing steel, glass, and engines in a self-contained ecosystem of industry. Visitors who toured the plant were awestruck by its scale. A city of machinery and labor that embodied the promise and peril of modern industry. By the late 1930s, as the world edged closer to another great conflict, Ford's story was poised to enter yet another chapter. The Depression had humbled him but not broken him. His company, though battered, still stood strong, and events on the horizon would soon demand that American industry rise to a challenge unlike any before. For Henry Ford, the coming years would intertwine his legacy with global events far beyond Detroit, reshaping his reputation once more. For now, as the night deepens in our story, imagine the weary faces of workers leaving the factory gates during the Depression years. Picture the long bread lines in city streets, the worn shoes of children whose families had lost everything, and the rusting cars parked motionless because their owners could no longer afford gasoline. Against this backdrop, the Ford Motor Company pressed onward, caught between a past that no longer fit and a future not yet secure. Henry Ford himself, once the great symbol of progress, had become a man struggling against time, unwilling to bend but unable to stop the turning wheel of history. Let your mind rest in the gentle quiet of a room lit by candlelight, where the flames sway slowly and shadows dance across the walls. Outside, you might imagine a soft rain tapping against the window, a steady rhythm that soothes the soul. In this calm, we return once more to Henry Ford's story, stepping now into the turbulent years when the world was drawn into a second Great War. The Depression had tested his empire, but the 1940s would demand even more, placing Ford Motor Company at the heart of one of history's greatest struggles. As Europe descended into conflict in the late 1930s, the United States remained officially neutral, though its industries were already preparing to supply materials to allies. Ford himself, however, was deeply resistant to America's involvement in foreign wars. A pacifist at heart, he had long declared that war was wasteful and immoral, and he believed his company's purpose was to make cars, not weapons. He even argued that if industry turned its power toward peace rather than arms, nations would have no reason to fight. His voice carried weight, but the tide of history was moving against him. Despite Ford's reluctance, the scale of the coming conflict soon became undeniable. In December 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor drew the United States fully into World War II. Overnight, Detroit, the Motor City, was transformed into the arsenal of democracy. Factories that once produced passenger cars were now called upon to build tanks, planes, engines, and weapons. The automobile industry would become a backbone of America's war effort, and Ford Motor Company was no exception. Ford himself remained hesitant, but his son Edsel stepped forward with determination. Edsel believed that the company had both a duty and an opportunity to serve. He pushed the company into full cooperation with the government, overseeing the rapid conversion of factories to military production. Under his leadership, Ford Motor Company undertook projects of staggering scale, including one of the most ambitious industrial undertakings of the war, the Willow Run plant. Willow Run, built in Michigan, was designed to mass-produce the B-24 Liberator bomber, one of the most important aircraft of the war. Before Willow Run, planes were built slowly by hand in small factories. The idea of producing bombers on an assembly line like automobiles seemed nearly impossible. But Ford's vision and Edsel's drive made it a reality. At its peak, Willow Run turned out a completed bomber every hour, an achievement so extraordinary that it stunned military leaders. The plant itself stretched more than a mile long, employing tens of thousands of workers, many of them women who had entered the workforce for the first time as men went off to fight. These women, often remembered as Rosie the Riveter, symbolized the home front's strength, and Willow Run became a symbol of American industrial might. The scale of Ford's contribution to the war effort was enormous. The company produced not only planes but also military trucks, tanks, jeeps, and engines. The River Rouge plant, once a monument to peacetime industry, now roared with the energy of wartime production. The Ford name, once synonymous only with cars, was now linked with victory on distant battlefields. Yet behind the achievements lay personal struggles. Henry Ford, aging and increasingly frail, resisted many of the changes that war demanded. His pacifism clashed with the reality of total war, and he often seemed out of step with the urgency of the moment. Much of the responsibility fell to Edsel, whose health was already suffering under the strain of leading the company during such a tumultuous time. Edsel Ford was admired by many who worked with him. Unlike his father, he was approachable, diplomatic, and open to new ideas. He pushed for modern car designs and embraced cooperation with the government and unions. But the constant pressure wore him down. In 1943, at just 49 years old, Edsel died of cancer, leaving the company without its steadying presence. His death was a devastating blow to the Ford family and the company alike. Henry Ford, heartbroken, attempted to step back into direct leadership despite his declining health. The government, concerned about the stability of such an important wartime supplier, intervened. By 1945, Henry Ford II, Edsel's son and Henry's grandson, was placed in charge. At only 28 years old, the younger Ford faced the daunting task of steering a vast company at a critical moment. His appointment marked the passing of leadership to a new generation, and in time it would transform the company's direction. Still, Henry Ford's role in the wartime years remained significant. Though he had resisted, his factories ultimately became engines of victory. The Willow Run plant alone produced more than 8,000 bombers, an achievement historians often call one of the greatest feats of industrial history. Ford's assembly line genius, first applied to cars, had been adapted to the machinery of war, and had helped tip the balance in favor of the Allies. But the war also highlighted the contradictions of Henry Ford's life. His pacifist ideals clashed with the reality of his company's production. His stubbornness often slowed progress while his innovations powered it. He was celebrated as a patriot even as critics remembered his controversial past. By the end of the war in 1945, Ford was both a legend and a relic, a man whose influence remained vast but whose era was fading. When peace finally came, the United States emerged stronger than ever, its economy booming and its people eager for the return of civilian life. For Ford Motor Company, this meant a return to cars, and under Henry Ford II, the company would enter a new era of growth, modernization, and competition. The elder Henry, though still alive, now lived largely in the shadow of his legacy, watching as his grandson carried the family name into the future. So as you sit in the quiet, imagine the roar of Willow Run's assembly lines, the steady march of workers pouring into the plant at dawn, and the sight of bombers rolling out one after another, bound for distant skies. This was Henry Ford's contribution to the war, a paradox of pacifism and production, of old age and new leadership. The man who had once revolutionized peacetime industry had, in his final chapter of influence, helped secure victory in the greatest conflict the world had ever known. Picture yourself once more in a place of stillness where the air feels calm and time seems to slow. A quiet lamp glows in the corner, its light soft and steady, while the faint creak of wood reminds you of an old house resting peacefully in the night. In this calm setting, we continue the story of Henry Ford, a man who had once set the world in motion but now found himself nearing the end of his journey. The roar of assembly lines and the thunder of war production had begun to fade, and in their place lingered memories, legacies, and the unshakable passage of time. By the mid-1940s, Henry Ford was no longer the tireless inventor or commanding industrialist he had once been. Age had taken its toll. His health was failing, and his sharp mind, once brimming with relentless ideas, grew clouded. At 80 years old, the man who had reshaped modern life was now a shadow of his former self. Yet the company he founded remained as powerful as ever, a testament to his vision even as his own strength waned. The loss of Edsel in 1943 weighed heavily on him. Edsel had been the bridge between Ford's stubborn traditions and the modern demands of business, and his death left both the company and the family adrift. Henry Ford grieved deeply, and though he briefly attempted to take full control again, it quickly became clear that the burden was too great. His decisions were increasingly erratic, and government officials worried about the stability of such a critical wartime supplier. The company that had once symbolized efficiency now seemed vulnerable. In 1945, the moment of transition finally arrived. With the war over and peace returning, leadership of Ford Motor Company passed to Henry Ford II, Edsel's son. At only 28, he inherited a company of immense size but also immense problems. The factories were outdated, labor relations were strained, and competitors like General Motors had surged ahead. The young Henry, nicknamed the Deuce, would need to modernize quickly if the company was to survive in the post-war world. For the elder Henry Ford, watching his grandson step into leadership was both a comfort and a reminder that his own era had passed. The world of 1945 was vastly different from the one he had entered as a curious farm boy in the 1870s. The United States had emerged from the war as the richest and most powerful nation on earth, and cars were no longer a rare marvel but a basic expectation of modern life. Highways stretched across the land, suburbs bloomed beyond city edges, and the car culture he had helped create now defined the American way of life. But Henry Ford himself remained a man of contradictions. Even in his final years, he held tightly to certain beliefs, some admirable, others deeply troubling. He continued to reject much of modern finance, preferring simplicity and control, though the world had grown too complex for such views. His reputation, once untarnished, carried scars from past controversies. Admirers saw him as a genius inventor who had lifted millions into the age of mobility. Critics saw him as stubborn, authoritarian, and often blind to the consequences of his actions. Both views held truth. As the late 1940s unfolded, Ford spent more time in quiet reflection. He often returned to Fair Lane, his estate along the River Rouge, where he had lived with his wife, Clara, since 1915. The house, surrounded by gardens, woods, and the flowing river, became his retreat. There he would walk the grounds, observe the machinery in his workshops, or simply sit in silence, listening to the sounds of the natural world. For a man who had once seemed inseparable from the roar of engines, these peaceful moments were reminders of his simpler beginnings. Those close to him noticed his decline. His once fierce energy was gone, replaced by frailty. Clara, his lifelong companion, remained by his side, offering care and support. Together they had weathered triumphs and scandals, joys and sorrows, and now, in old age, they leaned on each other as the world moved forward without them. On April 7, 1947, Henry Ford passed away at the age of 83. The cause was a cerebral hemorrhage. At the time of his death, the world he left behind was profoundly different from the one into which he had been born. In 1863, the year of his birth, the Civil War was still raging, and America was a largely rural, horse-driven nation. By 1947, automobiles filled the roads, airplanes crossed oceans, and highways stitched together a modern, mobile society. Ford had lived to see his dream realized on a scale far beyond even his imagination. The response to his passing was immense. Across America, people reflected on how the Model T had touched their lives. Obituaries praised him as a man who had given mobility to the masses, whose ideas had reshaped industry and society. Critics, too, spoke of his flaws, his resistance to change, his sometimes controversial views, and the hardships his workers endured. But whatever the judgment, none could deny that Henry Ford had been one of the most influential figures of the modern age. At his funeral, thousands gathered to pay their respects. Workers, executives, dignitaries, and ordinary people alike came to honor the man who had changed the way they lived. The service was simple, reflecting Ford's own dislike for extravagance. In death, as in life, he was both celebrated and complicated, a man who had embodied the promise and the contradictions of the American dream. For Ford Motor Company, his passing was not an end but a beginning of a new chapter. Under Henry Ford II, the company entered a period of transformation. The young leader modernized operations, strengthened labor relations, and introduced new designs that would carry Ford into the second half of the 20th century. The company became not only a manufacturer of cars but a symbol of American industry's resilience and adaptability. And yet, even as new generations took the wheel, Henry Ford's legacy remained everywhere. Every paved road, every suburban driveway, every daily commute bore traces of his vision. The very idea of America as a nation on the move, restless, mobile, always in motion, owed much to him. He had not only given people a machine but also reshaped their sense of time, distance, and possibility. As you sit in the quiet, imagine the closing of this long life, the farmhouse of his youth, the glowing lights of his factories, the hum of engines on America's roads, and finally, the peaceful stillness of Fairlane. The man who once sought to master time with his assembly lines ultimately could not escape it. And yet, in the span of his 83 years, Henry Ford had compressed centuries of change into a single lifetime. The twilight of his life was not without shadows, but it was also filled with the glow of accomplishments that reshaped the modern world. In the stillness, we feel both the weight of his contradictions and the power of his dream. He had built more than cars. He had built a vision of freedom, mobility, and progress that endures even now. Breathe in slowly and let yourself drift into a place of gentle quiet, where the world feels softened, like the last light of evening settling over fields of grass. A cool breeze stirs the leaves, a candle flickers nearby, and you feel the weight of history lingering in the air. We have traveled with Henry Ford from his boyhood curiosity in rural Michigan to the height of his industrial empire, through triumphs, controversies, wars, and decline. Now, in this final chapter, we turn not to events but to reflections on the man, his dream, and the enduring mark he left upon America and the world. Henry Ford's life was one of contradictions, and perhaps it is those contradictions that make him endlessly fascinating. He was at once a visionary and a traditionalist, a man of great generosity and deep stubbornness, a symbol of progress and a reminder of human fallibility. He gave the working class the chance to own a car, to travel farther and faster than ever before. And in doing so, he transformed the American landscape. Yet he also resisted change, clung to outdated ideas, and at times found himself mired in controversy. His story is not one of perfection, but of profound influence. At the heart of Henry Ford's vision was the belief that mobility was freedom. Before his time, most Americans lived within a few miles of where they were born. A horse could only take you so far, and a train could only take you where the tracks led. But with the automobile, suddenly the open road belonged to everyone. Families could visit relatives, explore new towns, and chase opportunities once out of reach. In this way, the car became more than a machine. It became a passport to independence, a symbol of the American dream. The ripple effects were enormous. Roads and highways stretched across the nation, linking rural and urban life. Suburbs grew as people no longer needed to live within walking distance of their jobs. Entire industries sprang up. Gas stations, motels, roadside diners, drive-in theaters, all born from the culture of the car. And through it all, Ford's Model T stood as the catalyst. Even decades after production ended, it remained a cultural icon, remembered not for its style but for its impact. Ford's methods of production left an equally lasting legacy. The moving assembly line, which had once shocked the world, became the model for modern manufacturing. Its principles spread far beyond the automobile industry, influencing how everything from refrigerators to airplanes was made. By breaking tasks into smaller steps, Ford showed how efficiency could unlock abundance. Factories around the globe adopted his methods, shaping the very rhythm of 20th century work. And yet, this efficiency came with costs. Work on the assembly line was repetitive, often exhausting, reducing skilled labor to mechanical tasks. The system that created prosperity also raised questions about individuality, dignity, and the human experience within industrial life. These debates continue today, as society balances the promise of technology with the need for meaning in work. Ford's ideas, both brilliant and problematic, still echo in those conversations. His $5 day, once revolutionary, remains one of his most celebrated acts. It symbolized a recognition that workers deserved not just survival wages, but the ability to participate in the economy they fueled. By paying more, Ford not only reduced turnover but also helped create a consumer class that could afford his cars. It was both practical and visionary, a moment when business and humanity intersected in ways that reshaped society. But no reflection on Henry Ford can ignore the shadows. His opposition to unions created bitter struggles. His publication of harmful and prejudiced views tarnished his reputation, leaving scars that history cannot erase. These flaws remind us that even those who change the world can carry darkness alongside light. To remember Henry Ford fully is to hold both truths, the genius and the failing, the dreamer and the flawed man. Today, Ford's name lives on, not only in the company, but in the very structure of modern life. The Ford Motor Company remains one of the great automakers of the world, its blue oval symbol recognized everywhere. The cars themselves have evolved, sleek, powerful, and now even electric. But behind each model lies a lineage tracing back to a tinkerer in a small Detroit workshop who once dreamed of building a simple, reliable car for everyone. Beyond cars, his legacy is woven into the fabric of the American dream. The idea that ordinary people can aspire to something better, that innovation can open doors of opportunity, that freedom is found not just in wealth but in mobility. These ideals carry his imprint. Every time someone sets out on a road trip, or moves to a new town, or simply enjoys the independence of driving to work, they are in some small way living in the world Henry Ford helped create. As the decades have passed, historians have debated his place in the story of America. Was he the greatest industrialist of his age, or a man who held back progress with his stubbornness? Was he a benefactor of the working class or an autocrat who demanded loyalty and conformity? The truth lies somewhere in between. He was not a hero in the simple sense, nor a villain, but a human being whose vision reshaped the contours of modern life. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of Henry Ford's story. The American dream is not a straight road, but a winding one, filled with light and shadow, success and failure, brilliance and error. Ford embodied all of these. His life reminds us that progress is never perfect, that dreams come with costs, but that the pursuit of them can transform the world. So now, as our long journey through history comes to its close, imagine the road stretching endlessly before you. The hum of an engine, the vast horizon, the promise of freedom. All of it born from a dream that began with a boy on a Michigan farm who refused to be content with what already existed. He wanted to build something new, something that would carry people farther than they had ever gone before, and in many ways he succeeded. The story of Henry Ford is the story of motion, of change, of dreams both realized and complicated. His name is carved into the road of history, his legacy carried forward every time wheels turn on pavement. And as you rest in the quiet glow of this moment, perhaps you can feel the echo of his dream. Still alive, still moving, still carrying us forward.